Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Good to see you.
Yes, sir.
I know you've had a busy week, but isn't it awesome to assemble on Yahweh's holy Sabbath?
Absolutely.
Have the holy convocation that's given to us in the scriptures that we are to observe. Amen. Are you ready for the word?
Yes, sir.
You can turn to Daniel and to James. Today I want to share with you a message, some of which I've shared with you before. The message being why I celebrate Hanukkah. The word Hanukkah means dedication, and it refers to an 8-day celebration that commemorates the rededication of the temple by the Maccabees after it had been desecrated by Antiochus Epiphanes, a ruler of the Seleucid Empire, which was a division of the Greek Empire after the death of Alexander the Great. I want you to know that there are sincere, Torah-loving, Yahweh-serving people that stand on both sides of this issue. There are some who observe it. There are some who do not observe it. I am one who does. So I want you to know why I observe it, even though it's not one of the 7 feasts of Leviticus 23, and even though we're not commanded to do so in Torah. But before I begin, let me tell you why I want you to know why I observe it. First of all, since we serve in the kingdom of Yahweh together, you should never have to wonder why I do something. Why I do what I do. If some do observe Hanukkah and some do not, then you have a right to know why I have chosen to observe it. How I came to this conclusion. And I'll share with you, I came to it after hours and hours and hours of study over months and years of time before I decided to do it. Second, I certainly quickly admit that it is understood, or it should be, that I certainly hope that I can have some influence over you. Right. And, share with you my view of this event and hope that it somehow or the other influences you. However, again, there are people on both sides of the issue. To begin, I want to go over our biblical history. I think it helps us to understand this event called Hanukkah. I'm sure there are better summaries out there than the one that I have printed for you, but I sat down, thought about the Bible. This is what I have written down, and it helps me to understand what we're dealing with. So I want to go over this chronology with you. Everybody get a copy of it?
I need one.
Bill, have we got some left?
We do.
All right.
Thank you.
To those who do listen to it online, if you would ever like a copy of anything we're doing here, all you got to do is instant message us, and I'll be glad to send a copy of that to you. My chronology begins in Genesis chapter 11. From Genesis 1 to Genesis 10, you've got the creation and the life of Noah, what happened there. In Genesis 11, it's given a genealogy, and it picks up covering the life of a man named Abraham. Abraham was Yahweh's covenant man. Yahweh entered into a covenant with this man that would affect all nations of the earth. After Abraham, he had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob's name was changed by Yahweh to what? Israel. And then you have all of his descendants begin to be referred to as the children of Israel. So when you read that, that's what you're reading, is the children of Jacob, or the children of Israel, who are the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of Abraham. The children of Israel go into Egypt. There they're taken, are made slaves. They're there for over 400 years. Yahweh sends Moses back, and there is a deliverance of these folks that takes place. There were 70 souls that went into Egypt. There were millions of them that came out. Moses leads them out of Egypt, leads them up to the land of promise. Yahweh had promised Abraham a specific piece of land. And he had told Abraham it would belong to him and his descendants. There was no timetable on that. It always would from that day belong to them, even to this day. Right. It belongs to them.
Yes, it does.
Right? So Moses leads them up to that land. And then he is followed by a man named Joshua, who will lead them into the land of promise. And while they are in the land of promise, after they take possession of it, and it's divided among the tribes, then there are judges that arise that begin to rule over them. Not rule over them is really a bad way of phrasing that. I know that's what I've written there, but they didn't rule over them. At times, they needed somebody to guide them. And Yahweh would raise up a judge who would guide them in the right paths to get them back where they needed to be. The last of these great judges was a man by the name of Samuel. Actually, Samuel was also a priest, prophet, judge. After Samuel, the people wanted a king. You remember them demanding a king. So the kings began to rule after the death of Samuel. The first king being Saul. Saul followed by David. David followed by Solomon. And then at Solomon's death, because his son would not listen to the people and would not listen to the wise instruction that he received, the kingdom becomes divided. And his son Rehoboam, son of Solomon, Rehoboam, reigns over the southern kingdom, which was known as Judah, and there were 2 tribes that made up that southern kingdom. 10 tribes revolted, pulled away, formed what was called the northern kingdom. You'll hear that referred to a lot in the Bible. They are called Israel. They take that name, Israel. Samaria becomes their capital, so sometimes they're called also the Samaritans. The northern kingdom is able to last until 722 BC, when the great big bad God beater upper Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, comes in and conquers them. So the northern kingdom is taken captive by Assyria around 722 BC. We're going to pause and let these other folks get in here and get settled in. Y'all come on in. Good morning. Good to see you. Again, the northern kingdom is taken captive by Assyria around 722 BC. And they're taken captive because they refuse to listen to the warnings by Elijah and Elisha and other great prophets. So when you read of the prophets Elijah and Elisha, they are prophesying during the reign and prophesying to the kings of the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom is taken captive by Babylon. Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BC by Nebuchadnezzar. And they refused to heed the warnings of the prophets that Yahweh sent to them, such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, and other great prophets. Both kingdoms were warned what would happen if they didn't listen, if they didn't repent, if they didn't turn back. Neither kingdom would repent and turn back, and both kingdoms were taken captive and destroyed. Babylon is later conquered by the Medes and Persians. Persia becomes the dominant power. Daniel served in the courts of both Babylon and Medo-Persia. So when you read about Daniel, that's where you can locate him. Persia is conquered by Alexander the Great, as was foretold in a vision to Daniel and by Daniel. Greece is divided into 4 kingdoms at Alexander's death, as also was foretold by Daniel. His 4 generals take possession of the kingdom that was established by Alexander the Great. Cassander takes possession of a property known as Macedonia. Ptolemy becomes the king over Egypt, and Antigonus becomes the king over the area known as Berea, Thessalonica, Philippi, and Seleucus takes over the largest of those areas and the largest of the kingdoms, and it becomes known as the Seleucid Empire. It extends northward to the Black Sea and Caspian Sea. It extends southward to the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. It extended westward to the Mediterranean Sea and eastward to India. Eventually, he would overtake much of Ptolemy's empire, and he would conquer Jerusalem. Out of the Seleucid kingdom arises Antiochus Epiphanes, who is determined to Hellenize the world. That is, to spread the Greek culture over the entire world. There will be one world government, one world religion. He's determined that that will be so. Now, when you hear the word Hellenize taught in school, they teach you that it just means to teach the Greek culture. That's not so. To Hellenize the world means that you terminate the Jews. You've got to do it, because if you don't stamp out truth, you can't teach your falsehood. Right. And so that's what he set out to do, was to either conquer the Jews through compromise or conquer them through death. And him not compromising with them learning to compromise with him. Antiochus conquers Jerusalem. He desecrated the temple. He made things like eating pork mandatory. He made Torah, Sabbath, and circumcision illegal. During his reign, a priest named Mattathias, with his family and followers, known as the Maccabees, led a revolt in which they retook Jerusalem and cleansed the temple. Children, what does Maccabee mean?
Hammer.
Hammer. That's right. They became the hammers of Yahweh. Sometimes Yahweh needs hammers. Wow. Then after the reign of the Greek empires, eventually the Romans move in and the Roman Empire arises. Well, that's the history of the Bible that leads us up to the age in which the descendants of Abraham and the land which Yahweh promised to Abraham were under the dominion of a Greek or a Gentile ruler by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. And the revolt led by a Jewish priest named Mattathias and his band of family and followers known as the Maccabees. That is the period in the events that are commemorated in Hanukkah. It's 175 years before the birth of the Messiah. So that's the part of history that we're talking about. Now let's talk in more detail about this tyrant we know as Antiochus. Antiochus' purpose was to turn all the world, as I said earlier, into one religion and one culture. He wanted Zeus to be worshipped. He dedicated temples to Zeus. One such temple was dedicated to Zeus the Hospitable. Think about that. Zeus the Hospitable. In other words, this religion that he was establishing was going to be about unity and peace and everybody walking in love with one another. That is, unity and peace and love and tolerance after the worship of Yahweh, and the worshipers of Yahweh are completely annihilated. Right. There is no love and tolerance and unity and peace until you destroy them, was his mindset. Antiochus was not opposed or resisted in his desire to turn the world to one religion and one culture as much as you think he should be or might have been. His intent is to turn the world to one religion and one culture. You would think that he would be resisted mightily, but he is not, because he comes in the name of peace. And he's not because of the influence that Alexander, his predecessor, because of the influence of Alexander and those that followed him, had upon much of the Jewish population. Many Jews had become Hellenized. They had determined it would be okay to compromise. They had determined that it would be okay to adapt and to adopt some of the practices that the Greeks were pushing on them. That means they began to incorporate much of the Greek culture into their own lives and into their own worship. Antiochus found allies in the Hellenized Jews who were willing to work with him to help him eliminate any Jew, and they were insistent that these Jews forsake Torah. So Antiochus, I'm going to restate that, found allies in Hellenized Jews who would help him oppose Jews who were intent on holding strictly to Torah. If they were intent on holding strictly to Torah, they had to be fought. They had to be opposed. Those who wanted to hold true to Torah were seen as legalistic. They were seen as being narrow-minded. They were seen as being troublemakers. That's the labels they began to get. And they needed to be convinced to compromise, or they had to be eliminated. Those are the only two options they had. And Antiochus, his armies, and his allies terminated tens of thousands of Jews who would not compromise their beliefs and who would not forsake Torah. He made it illegal to observe Sabbath. He made it illegal to keep the feast. He made the reading of Torah illegal. He burned every copy of Torah he found. Anyone found in possession of Torah or teaching Torah was killed on the spot. He made circumcision illegal. The apocryphal books of Maccabees tells us that 2 women in a certain town were discovered to have circumcised their infant sons. The infants were hung around the necks of the mothers. They were paraded through the city with their dead babies hanging from their necks. They were taken to the walls of the city where they were thrown off and plummeted to their death. Those were the actions of a man named Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus often would plan his attacks against the Jews on the Sabbath because he knew that many of them were so strict in their adherence to Sabbath, they would not fight back. They had to learn to, or he would have annihilated them all. Mattathias had to teach them that they had to defend themselves on the Sabbath. Tens of thousands were killed because they were not. Antiochus was cruel. It became illegal to even identify yourself as a Jew. Everybody in the whole world was Greek. He went into the temple of Yahweh, sacrificed unclean animals there, sprinkled pig blood on the altar, and that act in the book of Daniel is called the abomination of desecration. He insisted that all people work on the Sabbath, and he insisted that everybody eat pork. It is recorded that one servant of Yahweh in his 90s was told to eat. He refused. Soldiers held him down, forced it into his mouth. He spit it out, and he was killed. There's another story, and we've gone over it before, and I will not go over all the details with you again here today. But in 2 Maccabees 7, the story of a mother who had 7 sons that remained true to Torah, remained true to Yahweh, and Antiochus tortured and killed them. He had them brought forth before him, and all he required them to do was to eat swine, eat pork. They were promised great riches if they would just eat the pork. They refused. They were threatened that if they did not eat the pork, they would be tortured and then killed. They understood. They refused. That story helps us, I think, to understand Acts 10 better. Peter's refusal in his vision when he was told, rise, kill, and eat. He was adamant in his refusal. 3 times in that vision, adamant in his refusal. Rise, kill, and eat. Peter said, not so, sir. He said, I have never, and that word never means never at any time. It's the most adamant refusal you can possibly give. I have never at any time eaten anything that is common or unclean. Peter understood it to be a transgression of the law. Peter wouldn't do it in the vision when he was told to, because it would transgress the law. These 7 sons in the book of Maccabees would not do it before a wicked king who promised them riches. And they would not do it in front of a wicked king that threatened them with torture and death, because it was a transgression of the law. All 7 sons were brought forth one by one, tortured and killed. Throughout the event, the mother was told by Antiochus to counsel her sons to comply with him so that he didn't have to kill them. Instead, in her Hebrew tongue, she would speak to her sons and encourage them to remain true to Yahweh. Maccabees, the book of Maccabees makes this observation about that woman and her speeches to her sons. It says this of her: she spoke with the reason of a woman and with the courage of a man. Listen to the words she spoke to her youngest son when all of his older brothers had already been tortured and killed. And Antiochus is pleading with her and that youngest boy to just eat the pork so that they can live. Here's what she said to her youngest son in the Hebrew tongue. Son, look around. Everything you see was made by Yahweh out of things that you cannot see. He is our creator. He is our Elohim. Do not fear this tormentor. Be worthy of your brothers, that I might receive you again with them. With that, she sent him to his death. What faithfulness. What courage. What conviction. Antiochus was a man who came in the name of peace and unity, compromise, hospitality, but that was only for those who would transgress and forsake Torah and forsake the true worship of Yahweh. Those who would not were tortured brutally and killed without mercy, as were these 7 sons of that woman. A decree went out that every city and every village was to show their allegiance to Antiochus and to Zeus by eating pork and by participating in a sacrifice to Zeus. A senator and a band of soldiers from Antiochus came to the town of a Jewish priest by the name of Mattathias. He was told to lead the town into this new world peace by eating pork and offering the sacrifice. He refused. Another Jewish man stepped forth to comply. Mattathias, with the zeal of Phinehas, killed that man and then killed the senator. He then cried out, all who are zealous for Torah and supports the covenant, follow me. Not a long speech, is it?
No.
But it gets to the point quick.
Yes.
All who are zealous for Torah and supports the covenant, follow me. So many people forget we have a covenant.
Right.
And there's no such thing as a covenant that only binds one member of the covenant.
Right.
Yahweh's bound to that covenant, but so are we.
Yes, sir.
Amen.
A revolt was born that day. It took years, but Mattathias with his sons and the small remnant that followed him led attacks against Antiochus. Do you understand the significance of that act that day? Do you understand that had they not revolted, had they compromised, had they done what they were being told to do, then you and I would not sit today with any knowledge of Torah,
Right.
or of Yahweh, or of the feast, or of the Sabbath,
Right.
or of the Messiah.
Right.
The Messiah can only be understood in terms of what was promised down through the ages.
Right.
If you take and contaminate Torah, eliminate it or contaminate it, if you add compromise to it and twist it and pervert it, then nobody would have ever been able to recognize the Messiah.
Right.
He was recognized because of how he fit. He was the living word.
Yes, sir.
So if you do away with the written word, you can't recognize the living word.
Right.
Right.
The Bible tells us that Yahweh's truth endures to all generations, but it endures to all generations because in every generation there is a remnant who will not forsake it. No matter how outnumbered they are, no matter how ridiculed they are, no matter how many times people look at them like they're strange, they believe what's written in that book and they walk accordingly to what's written in that book.
Yeah.
Had Mattathias said, you know what, guys, it ain't worth dying over. Eat the ham sandwich. then everything would have been contaminated. Everything would have been compromised. The Greeks and the Gentiles would have taken over. There would have been no truth to endure. At Mattathias' death, he instructs that his son Judah should lead the campaigns against Antiochus because of his great zeal. Mattathias called that boy Judah Maccabee, Judah the hammer of Yahweh. And pretty soon this moniker, this name, is used to describe all that participated in the revolt. They were the hammers of Yahweh, used to smash Antiochus and his Seleucid empire, to turn back this Greek movement. Judah and his small army of men retook Jerusalem. They removed and destroyed all the pagan altars and the furniture in the temple. They cleansed it, as was prophesied in Daniel chapter 8. The day they cleansed the temple and rededicated it was the 25th of Kislev, the 25th day of the 9th month, which was the exact day that it had been desecrated years before by Antiochus. They replaced the old altars with new altars and the old temple furniture with new furniture. And they put consecrated oil in the menorah and lit it. And they celebrated the cleansing of the temple for 8 days. 2 Maccabees 10 tells us why they celebrated for 8 days. 2 Maccabees 10 tells us it was because just before retaking Jerusalem, they had lived in the mountains. They had lived in the caves. They had lived in dens like beasts of the field. And while in those mountains, in those conditions, they kept the Feast of Tabernacles. They kept Sukkot. So now in the 9th month, they determined to celebrate their victory in cleansing the temple also for 8 days, and to use palm branches and dancing just as they were to do at Sukkot, to use it to express their joy and thankfulness to Yahweh for what he had done. They decreed that the victory was so great and the event so monumental that it should always be celebrated on the 25th day of the 9th month. And it should be done for 8 days. That's what they decreed. It's not in Torah. You cannot observe Hanukkah and not be in transgression of the law, because the law does not instruct us to do so. This was their decree. But now I want to tell you why I celebrate Hanukkah. I do it because, number one, I find it suspicious that there is so much resistance to celebrating it. When I first heard all the opposing views of it, I got suspicious. It seems to me that there is demonic influence behind the opposition. I'm not saying that if somebody doesn't celebrate Hanukkah, then they're under demonic influence. I'm not even closely saying that, not at all. But I am saying that there seems to be a lot of opposition to the observance of the remembrance of this historical event. It is in history. It is recorded. People who will remember other historical events, such as Independence Day, as we talked about last week, or D-Day, or 9/11, or their own birthday, even though that's not instructed in Torah, use the absence of instruction in Torah about Hanukkah to refuse to remember it. I find that suspicious. Not the motives of sincere people. I'm suspicious of how demons work to influence masses. I look at this event and I can see why the devil does not want it to be remembered, I guess is what I'm trying to say. That's a better way of saying it. When I look at the details of this event, I can see why the devil would hope we would never talk about it.
Yeah. Right.
The intent of Antiochus is the prime directive of Satan. What did Antiochus want to do? Wipe out Torah. And wipe out true worship of Yahweh. That is the prime directive of Satan.
Right.
He wants Torah eliminated. He wants Israel exterminated. He tried to do it with pharaohs. before Antioch.
Right.
He tried to do it with Nebuchadnezzar and with Sennacherib. He tried to do it with Alexander. He tried to do it with Antiochus. And he has continued beyond Antiochus.
Right.
He tried to do it with Rome. He tried to do it with Hitler. And he is still to this day trying to do it.
Right.
Why is there so much talk of peace and unity and compromise and tolerance and one world government, religion and universalism and beliefs today? Because Satan does not want people to know the truth. Hanukkah is a reminder that there are times that those who have zeal for Torah and are faithful to the covenant have to stand up against the world system. So I find it suspicious that there is resistance to this historical event. When the world or the majority rejects something, it makes me wonder why.
Yeah. Right.
When I read this event and became knowledgeable of this event and all of the different things you can find out about it, my first thought was, why didn't they teach me this in Sunday school class?
Yeah.
Why didn't they teach me this in school? Why did they teach me about Alexander the Great, but they didn't teach me about Mattathias?
Right. Right.
Why would they teach me about Hellenizing, but not teach me about the true worship of Yahweh?
Yeah.
You get suspicious.
Right.
And in considering all of that, I have concluded that Hanukkah is an event that, when remembered, sheds light on the continuing efforts of Satan and his Antichrist to eliminate Torah and eradicate Israel. Therefore, I want to remember it.
Amen.
Number two, it's a yearly reminder of the spiritual hatred that exists against Israel. We need to be reminded that throughout every generation, Satan has raised up wicked men to seek to annihilate the Jews and to stamp out truth in every generation. Years ago, I was awakened with these words. I was living at Pettit Circle. And I was laying in the bed. This was early in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning. I think it was around 4 o'clock in the morning. I have to go back and find my notes to know for sure. But somewhere around 4 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened with these words. Watch for the sign of Edom. Y'all remember that?
Yes.
It made me sit straight up in bed. The warning was real. Watch for the sign of Edom. I come up out of the bed. I knew the warning was real, but I didn't have a clue what it meant. I got up. I walked outside. I stayed outside until daylight, praying and meditating and walking and sitting, trying to figure out, get more information. Yahweh, I heard that. What did you mean by that?
Right.
Got nothing. I got up when daylight came, I went in the house, got dressed, I went to my office, and I spent days studying. And I discovered what he meant. The sign of Edom is a reference to the unrelenting hatred for the children of Israel that was born in the heart of Esau. And it was passed down as a curse from generation to generation by demon spirits working in the heart of all of Esau's descendants. Antiochus was not the first, nor will he be the last, who attempted to erase their existence. Even to this day, Esau's descendants have a perpetual hatred for Israel that they cannot explain. It's just there. And Yahweh was warning us, watch for it in your day. You will see this hatred arise. So that's a second reason that I like Hanukkah. It reminds us of that spiritual hatred that exists. Number three, Hanukkah is a reminder of how much Satan hates Torah.
Right.
He told Eve, yea, has Yahweh said?
Right.
From the beginning until now, he has wanted to turn the hearts of people from Torah, the instruction of Yahweh. People know what Torah says, but Satan still works in the hearts and minds of people to get them to reject that. Surely he didn't mean that. Surely he didn't mean for you to worship on the Sabbath. I know he said remember it, but the Messiah was resurrected on Sunday, they come up with. That's a fable.
Right.
But they come up with that to turn people away. Well, surely Yahweh understands. He didn't mean for us to keep doing it on that seventh day, right? Yea, hath Yahweh said.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, me.
Right.
We could go on and on, but I won't. Satan's hatred for Torah is infused within the hearts of men. He causes men to not only rebel against Torah, but he is so good he convinces men that Torah is really the cause of all the woes of men.
Yeah.
He convinces them it is Torah that causes trouble. If you could just get rid of Torah, we all could live in peace and unity. That's what he convinces them.
Right.
He convinces them that it's Torah that's bringing bondage into your life. If you could free yourself from Torah, then you would be free indeed. And people now look at Torah as the greatest attack against their freedom instead of sin against Torah. Surely Yahweh doesn't want you to keep all of those ridiculous commands about what you can eat and what day you should worship and whether you can mix linen and wool. Surely Yahweh don't want you to keep doing all of that. You see? It's still the same thing he did to Eve in the garden. Yea, has Yahweh said.
Right.
Because of the way he works in the hearts of men, you find that the masses, the majority, speak evil of the truth. Satan, through the ages, has hated Torah and has always influenced the world to reject it, to rebel against it, to seek to erase it from existence. We need to be reminded that that's what he does.
Right. Yes.
Hanukkah reminds us.
Right.
Number 4, Hanukkah reminds us that the servants of Yahweh are always in minority and must always be brave and bold. Hanukkah reminds us that our obedience to Yahweh involves resistance to the world. I told you to turn to James earlier. Let's read that. James 4. You adulterers, James 4:4. You adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with Yahweh? You there?
Yes, sir.
Well, James wasn't being very nice, was he? No. Calling people names. When you start getting friendly with the world, James says you're an adulterer. And when you start being friendly with the world, he said you are at enmity with Yahweh. Listen to the last sentence. Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of Yahweh. We'll read it all together. You adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with Yahweh? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of Yahweh. We are not expected to fit in.
Right.
Actually, it is expected that we not fit in.
Right.
There's pressure everywhere for us to turn to compromise and to unite. There's pressure to go along. Hanukkah is a reminder that Yahweh's servants must be bold and courageous and not fear the rejection of men. How can we justify fearing what others will think of us when those who went before us stood bold, knowing it wasn't what somebody else thought that was the problem?
Right.
It was the fact they were going to be tortured and killed when they stood strong.
Right.
How can we justify fearing what they're going to think
Right.
when they were our predecessors, our our forefathers were willing to die to remain true to Torah. There's no justification for a lack of courage that we might have among our co-workers, our friends, our neighbors, and our family. There's no justification for it. Hanukkah reminds us that we will be in the minority, but we should be bold and brave. Look in Daniel 11. Daniel 11:32, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. But the people that do know their Elohim shall be strong and do exploits. Exploits is in italics.
Right.
The Hebrew word there for do is asah, and asah, A-S-A-H, simply means to do. That's what it means. You look it up, it means to do. The word translated as strong means to be strong in courage. It really means to be courageous. So here's what this verse is telling us. Those who know their Elohim shall be courageous, and they shall do. Those who know Yahweh should be courageous enough to do something when something needs to be done.
Amen.
Do what? Whatever needs to be done.
Yeah.
Those that know Yahweh are courageous, and they do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. How can you find those who know Him? They're courageous enough to act. Peter said, men ought to obey Yahweh, not men.
Yeah.
We ought to obey Yahweh, not men. That's the kind of courageous acts Hanukkah reminds us to embrace. Why don't you eat pork, somebody said. Well, because we ought to obey Yahweh and not men.
Amen.
Why do you worship on the seventh day? Because we ought to obey Yahweh, not men.
Right. Amen.
Why do you keep those feasts listed back there in that Old Testament? Oh, well. Because we ought to obey Yahweh
Yes, sir.
Amen.
Yes, sir.
and not men. And on and on and on. That should be our answer. Hanukkah reminds us to be bold and courageous, even though we are in the minority. Why do I celebrate Hanukkah? Let me tell you why. I celebrate it to show my resistance to unity, compromise, and the world's concept of peace.
Amen.
Yeah.
I celebrate it to show my resistance to lawlessness, which masquerades as progressiveness and hospitality. I celebrate it to show my resistance to idolatry, which presents itself as a viable option to be embraced and adopted instead of strict adherence to the instruction of Yahweh as to how He is to be worshipped.
Amen.
Why do I celebrate Hanukkah? I celebrate Hanukkah to show my commitment to the Sabbath, to show my commitment to the dietary laws, to show my commitment to the Moedim, the feast of Yahweh, to show my commitment to all of Torah, just as Mattathias and his children showed their commitment to Yahweh and to Torah.
Amen.
Hanukkah is a wonderful time to remind myself and to teach my children and grandchildren and you and others about mighty servants of Yahweh who left us a shining example to follow. Hanukkah is a wonderful time to remind myself and to teach my family about the evil workings of wicked spirits and the evil workings of wicked men who work against Yahweh, Torah, and the Jews, and to warn them to beware of the presence of that wickedness in their day, all of their days. Each night we light a candle. We do so with the remembrance that it costs some people great sacrifice to be able to do that in the temple. We light a candle each night, remind ourselves that Yahweh's truth endures to all generations, and we're thankful that it endured to ours. It's true because every generation has had a remnant who stood up and would not compromise it. Why do I celebrate Hanukkah? Well, Yahweh foretold of the events that would lead to the temple being desecrated and then eventually being cleansed. I have determined that if it was important enough to be foretold,
Right.
then it is definitely important enough to be remembered. Why do I celebrate Hanukkah? Our Messiah walked in the temple during Hanukkah, as recorded in John 10. He did not condemn it, but instead seemed to preach a message about Hanukkah, or at least had a Hanukkah tone.
Right.
As he stood there during the Feast of Dedication, he said, "My sheep hear my voice, and the voice of a stranger they will not follow." Amen. That's what Antiochus and everybody like him has always done. Tried to get you to follow their voice.
Right.
Instead of the voice of Torah, the voice of Yahweh, the voice of the Messiah. My sheep hear my voice, and the voice of a stranger they will not follow. Why do I celebrate Hanukkah? Because it is the annual celebration of the triumph of truth over lies,
Yes,
and good over evil.
Amen.
In our celebration of it, my family has chosen to not only light the candles, but we've also chosen to give gifts. Make no mistake about it, we're not looking for a substitute for Christmas. Everything about Christmas is pagan.
Right.
There's nothing associated with it that we care to retain. But no matter how much you adapt and adopt and baptize those things and those activities, they will always remain pagan. But the giving of gifts is not a pagan activity. I examined it, I thought about it, I prayed about it. There's nothing pagan about giving gifts. Everything pagan was terminated. If I can bless my children and grandchildren while teaching them truth, then I find that activity to be consecrated and to be holy. Hanukkah is a time that I can say to my family, "Come unto me, let me bless you with gifts, and let me tell you about a wicked man, a courageous family, and an awesome Elohim.
Yeah.
Sit here with me, and let's be thankful to Yahweh." The Maccabees chose to wave palm leaves. The act was consecrated and holy. I have chosen to give gifts. I believe that act to be consecrated and holy. It's not a Christmas gift given during Hanukkah. It's not given as a substitute for Christmas. No, they're given with the heart's desire to make this day as special as possible to my family, so that we would never forget the events that Hanukkah commemorates. Everybody has to choose for themselves. And if somebody chooses not to, there is no fault to accuse them of, because Torah does not command it. So if somebody chooses not to observe it, there is no fault to accuse them of. I choose to observe it, and there's no fault to accuse me of, because Torah does not forbid it.
Right. Amen.
Stand up.
Amen.
I'm glad you were here.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for letting me share that with you again. I truly am thankful to serve in the kingdom of Yahweh with you.
Amen.
I love you much. Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh lift up his countenance upon you and give you shalom. As his name is put upon you, so shall he bless you.